about power, about who has it, who abuses it, and what happens when the tables turn in ways no one could predict. This is a story of Judge Alicia Thompson. But on the night of March 15th, 2024, she wasn't a judge yet. She was just another black woman driving home from work. And that made all the difference. IT was 9:47 p.m. Alicia Thompson had been at her law office late, preparing for her judicial confirmation hearing scheduled for the next week. She'd worked for 15 years to get here. Assistant District Attorney, Senior Prosecutor, now about to become one of the youngest black female judges in the state. She was exhausted but exhilarated. She was almost home, and then she saw the lights, blue and red flashing in her rearview mirror. Alicia's heart sank, but she knew the drill. She wasn't speeding. Her tags were current. Her license was valid. Everything was in order. It was always in order, because she knew what happened when it wasn't. She'd been a prosecutor long enough to know that traffic stops could turn deadly for people who looked like her. She pulled over on a quiet residential street in her own neighborhood, a neighborhood she'd scraped together a down payment to afford after years of saving. She rolled down her window, turned on the interior light, put both hands on the steering wheel where they could be seen. She'd done this before. Every black person has done this before. The officer approached her window. His name was Marcus Reed. Badge number 2847, 38 years old, 12 years on the force. 17 complaints filed against him over the years. None sustained. He had a pattern. Young black men, black women driving alone at night. Traffic stops that escalated quickly. But nothing ever stuck. The union protected him. The department protected him. The system protected him. Officer Reed demanded her license and registration. His tone was cold, aggressive from the start. Alicia remained calm and professional. She asked what she'd been pulled over for. Reed didn't answer. He just repeated his demand more aggressively this time. Alicia explained that she would reach into her glove compartment for her registration and into her purse for her license. She announced every movement clearly, trying to make herself non-threatening. Because that's what you do when you're black and pulled over. You perform compliance. You perform docility. You make yourself small. Even when you're about to become a judge, Reed looked at her license. His tone shifted when he saw her name, Alicia Thompson. He made a comment about her name, his voice dripping with something she couldn't quite identify. Contempt? Suspicion? Then, without explanation, he ordered her to step out of the vehicle. Alicia was confused but compliant. She asked again why she'd been pulled over. Reed's response was to order her out more aggressively, his hand moving toward his weapon. Alicia felt her pulse quicken. She'd prosecuted cases like this. She knew how quickly things could go wrong. That Reed's partner, Officer David Chun, stood nearby. He was 42 years old, Marcus's partner for 3 years. He'd seen Marcus get rough before. He'd never reported it. That made him complicit. That made him guilty too. Now, watching the stop escalate, Chin shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. He was making a choice in real time. Be a good cop or be a good colleague. He chose the latter. Reed ordered Alicia to turn around and place her hands on the vehicle. She complied, asking once more what she had done wrong. Reed said she'd been driving suspiciously. Driving suspiciously. She was driving home on a street. She drove every night, 2 blocks from her own house. But Reed had decided she didn't belong there. Or maybe he just wanted to assert his authority. Maybe he saw a black woman alone on a quiet street and decided he could do whatever he wanted. Reed grabbed Alicia's arm to search her. His grip was tight, painful. Alicia instinctively pulled back, telling him he was hurting her. And that's when everything changed. Marcus Reed slapped Alicia Thompson across the face. Open palm. Hard enough that her head snapped to the side. Hard enough that she tasted blood. Hard enough that she stumbled back against her car. The street was quiet. No witnesses. No cameras except the body cam on Reed's chest. Footage he clearly didn't think would matter. Just Alicia, Marcus, and David Chun, who stood frozen, having already decided to say nothing. Alicia was in shock. She touched her face, feeling the sting, the heat, the humiliation. She told Reed, He had just hit her. He responded by saying she'd been resisting, that she pulled away from him. Alicia's anger broke through her fear. She said she'd pulled away because he was hurting her, that he had no right to strike her. Reed's response was to arrest her for resisting arrest and assaulting an officer. The irony would have been laughable if it weren't so terrifying. He had hit her, and now he was arresting her for it. It was a tactic as old as policing itself. Brutalize someone, then charge them with a crime to justify the brutality. Chin finally spoke up, weakly suggesting that maybe they should reconsider. Reed shut him down immediately, telling him to call it in, to report that the suspect had resisted arrest and that necessary force had been used. Necessary force. That's what they always called it. Reed handcuffed Alicia, her hands behind her back. She told him she was an attorney, that she was about to be confirmed as a judge, that she had rights, that she wanted to call her lawyer. Reed laughed. He mocked her, said she could call whoever she wanted from the station. Alicia realized the full horror of her situation. Her confirmation hearing was in 1 week. If this arrest went on her record, if she was charged with assaulting a police officer, her entire career was over. Everything she'd worked for, 15 years of grinding through law school, through the prosecutor's office, through countless trials, could be destroyed in minutes because of a cop who didn't know who she was and didn't care. Reed put her in the back of his patrol car. She sat there, handcuffed, her face throbbing, her future hanging by a thread. But Officer Marcus Reed had made one critical mistake. He'd assumed she was powerless. He'd assumed she had no recourse. He'd assumed that because she was black and female and alone on a quiet street at night, he could do whatever he wanted and get away with it. He was about to learn otherwise as the patrol car pulled away. Alicia sat in the back seat, her mind racing. She memorized everything. Reed's badge number, 2847. Chen's badge number, 3156. The time, 10:04 p.m. The location, Maple Street and 15th Avenue. Every detail. Because she knew the law. She knew that details mattered. Evidence mattered. And right now, strapped with body cameras, Reed and Chun had just created the evidence that would destroy them. Like her, she thought about how this arrest, even if the charges were dropped, could be weaponized against her. They'd ask about her temperament, her judgment, whether she could be impartial, whether she had a grudge against law enforcement. But beneath the fear, something else was building. Rage. Cold, focused rage. Because Alicia Thompson hadn't survived law school as one of 3 black women in her class, hadn't worked 80-hour weeks as a junior prosecutor, hadn't tried dozens of cases and won most of them, just to be destroyed by a cop with a God complex and a history of violence. She thought, "You don't know who I am, Officer Reed. You don't know what I've survived to get here. You don't know that I've memorized your badge number. You don't know that I know the law better than you ever will. You don't know that in 1 week, I'm going to be Judge Alicia Thompson. And you just made the biggest mistake of your life." But first, she had to survive the night. The police station was fluorescent bright and too cold, the way government buildings always are. It was 10:30 p.m. when they brought Alicia in. They processed her like any other suspect. Fingerprints, photos, personal belongings confiscated. The booking officer asked if she had any injuries. Alicia said yes. That Officer Reed had struck her in the face. The officer wrote it down without looking up, without apparent interest. Just another box to check on the form. They put her in a holding cell. She asked for a phone call. They said she'd get it soon. 20 minutes passed. Then 30. Alicia knew what they were doing. Making her wait. Making her uncomfortable. Asserting control. It was psychological warfare, and she'd seen it used on defendants countless times. Now she was on the receiving end. Finally, at 10:52 p.m., a desk sergeant opened the cell door and led her to a phone. She had 3 minutes. Alicia dialed the number she'd memorized years ago. James Carter. Her mentor, her friend, one of the best defense attorneys in the state. James answered on the second ring, his voice groggy with sleep. When Alicia identified herself and told him she'd been arrested, he snapped awake immediately. She explained quickly. Traffic stop, aggressive officer. She'd pulled away when he hurt her. He'd slapped her, arrested her for resisting and assaulting an officer. James was furious. He told her he was coming to the station immediately and that she shouldn't say another word to anyone. Before hanging up, James asked if she'd gotten the officer's name and badge number. Alicia said yes. Marcus Reed, badge 2847. She told James she would never forget it. There was steel in her voice, and James recognized it. This wasn't just about defending a client for him. This was personal. Alicia wasn't just his former colleague. She was like a daughter to him. And someone had hurt her. 45 minutes later, James Carter walked through the doors of the 14th precinct. He was a tall black man in his 50s, wearing an expensive suit despite the late hour. He carried himself with the authority of someone who'd spent 30 years fighting the system and winning more often than losing. When he approached the desk sergeant and announced he was there for his client, his tone left no room for argument. The desk sergeant tried the usual deflections. She'd been charged with serious crimes. She wasn't going anywhere tonight. James cut through every excuse with surgical precision. He pointed out that they'd stopped processing her the moment she'd invoked her right to an attorney, that they'd held her for over an hour without formally charging her, that he wanted the body cam footage from Reed and Chin immediately, or he'd have a judge issue an emergency order within the hour. And he promised that if that footage mysteriously disappeared or got corrupted, the department would be swimming in lawsuits. There was a long pause. The desk sergeant made a phone call. 10 minutes later, Lieutenant Sharon Brooks arrived. She was a black woman in her 50s, 25 years on the force, no nonsense, and politically savvy. She knew immediately that the situation was different. This wasn't some kid from the projects with a public defender. This was James Carter, representing a woman about to become a judge. This had the potential to blow up in ways that could end careers. Brooks asked to speak with James privately. In her office, she tried the standard lines. The report said Alicia had been combative, that Reed had to subdue her. James didn't flinch. He said Reed had slapped his client across the face, that she had a visible bruise and split lip, that he would photograph it and release it to every media outlet in the city if necessary. Brooks paused. She was calculating. This would go in two ways: contain it now or let it explode later. Brooks said she wanted to review the body cam footage. James agreed to wait. For 20 minutes, he stood outside her office, checking his watch, texting colleagues, preparing for war. He knew how this worked. He knew that even with video evidence, the system would try to protect its own. But he also knew that Alicia wasn't just any victim. She had resources. She had connections. She had credibility. And in 1 week, she'd have power. When Brooks emerged from her office, her expression was carefully controlled. She told James that Alicia was being released. All charges were being dropped. Reed was being placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. James pressed. An internal investigation? That was it? Brooks became defensive, saying it was an ongoing personnel matter she couldn't discuss. James cut her off. He told her exactly what would happen next. Alicia would file a formal complaint. She'd file a civil rights lawsuit. And if the department tried to sweep this under the rug, every news outlet in the city would know what Reed had done. Brooks asked if that was a threat. James said no. It was a promise. They brought Alicia out. She looked exhausted. There was a dark purple bruise blooming on her left cheek. Her lip was swollen, but her eyes were clear, furious, focused. She asked James if he'd seen the footage. He said yes. She said then he knew. He confirmed that he knew everything, that Reed had assaulted her, lied about it, and arrested her to cover it up. They left the station together in the parking lot. Alicia stood looking back at the precinct building. It was almost 1 a.m. Her face hurt. Her pride hurt worse. She told James that her confirmation hearing was in 6 days, that even though the charges were dropped, the senators would ask about this. They'd make it seem like she'd done something wrong. James was honest with her. He said they might try, but she had something most people didn't. Proof. The body cam footage showed everything. Reed grabbing her, her pulling away, him hitting her, then lie about what happened. Alicia gave a bitter laugh. She asked how many times they'd both seen footage like that mean nothing. How many times cops have been caught on video doing horrific things and faced no consequences are coming. And Reed didn't know it yet, but he just assaulted a future judge. Alicia corrected him. If she still became a judge. James firmly said when she became a judge. Because they weren't letting the system take this from her. They were going to fight so loudly and so publicly that the department couldn't ignore it. Alicia said she was tired. So tired of fighting. James understood, but reminded her she wasn't fighting alone. They got in his car and he drove her home. They drove in silence for several minutes. Alicia stared out the window at her city. The city she'd served as a prosecutor for a decade. The city she was about to serve as a judge. The city that had just allowed one of its officers to assault her with impunity. Finally, Alicia broke the silence. She said the worst part was that she'd done everything right. She'd been polite. She'd announced every movement. She hadn't gotten smart or raised her voice until he was already hurting her. And none of it had mattered. It hadn't mattered because Reed had seen a black woman alone and decided he could do whatever he wanted. James simply said he knew. He let her vent. She continued, her anger building. She said tomorrow she'd have to prepare for a confirmation hearing where senators would question her temperament, her judgment, whether she could be impartial. They'd question whether she was fit to be a judge. Her. Meanwhile, the cop who'd assaulted her would get paid leave and probably be back on the street in 6 months. Alicia went further. She said she knew how many cases she'd prosecuted where cops had lied, where they'd planted evidence or coerced confessions or used excessive force. She'd gone along with it because that was her job. She was supposed to be on their side, supposed to trust them. And now she understood what so many defendants had tried to tell her over the years, that the system was rigged, that police lied, that justice was a fantasy for people who looked like her. James said simply, "Now you know." And Alicia asked a question that would define everything that came next. What do I do with that knowledge? How do I walk into that courtroom and take an oath to uphold a system that just did this to me? James gave her the answer that would become her mission. He said she didn't walk in to uphold the system. She walked in to change it, from the inside. With power, they'd arrived at Alicia's house. The house she'd bought 3 years ago with money she'd saved by working brutal hours and living below her means. The house in the safe neighborhood that clearly wasn't safe for her. She thanked James for everything. He told her to get some sleep. Tomorrow, they'd file the complaint. And then they'd win. Alicia got out of the car and walked her front door. She unlocked it and went inside, straight to the bathroom. She turned on the light and looked at herself in the mirror. The bruise was already a deep purple. Her lip was swollen, split slightly at the corner. She looked like she'd been in a fight. She had been in a fight, just not the one Marcus Reed would claim. She washed her face gently, careful around the bruise, changed into pajamas, got into bed, but sleep wouldn't come. She lay there in the dark, replaying every second of the encounter, his hands on her arm, the sound of the slap, the shock and pain, the humiliation of being handcuffed, the fear that everything she'd worked for was over. And then slowly, as the hours passed and dawn approached, something shifted. The fear began to transform into something else, something harder, something dangerous. Alicia thought, "You wanted to make me small, Officer Reed. You wanted to remind me of my place. You wanted me to be afraid. You wanted me to disappear quietly, to drop this, to be grateful that the charges were dismissed and move on with my life. But here's what you don't understand. I've been afraid my whole life. Afraid as a black girl in predominantly white schools where teachers assumed I was there because of affirmative action, not merit. Afraid as a black woman in white law firms where partners questioned whether I was a lawyer or a paralegal. Afraid every time I see blue lights in my rearview mirror, knowing that the wrong move could mean death. But I'm done being afraid. In 6 days, I'm going to that confirmation hearing, and I'm going to tell them exactly what happened. I'm going to show them my face. I'm going to make them see what you did. And I'm going to become Judge Alicia Thompson anyway, not in spite of what you did, but because of it, because you just reminded me why I wanted this job in the first place. Not to uphold the system as it exists, but to change it, To be the judge I needed when I was sitting in that police station tonight. To be the voice for everyone you've hurt and everyone you'll never hurt again. And when I put on that robe, Officer Reed, you're going to see me again. Because sooner or later, everyone ends up in my courtroom. And I'm going to remember you. Alicia woke up at 6 a.m. after maybe 2 hours of sleep. Her face still hurt. Her pride hurt worse. But she got up, got dressed in a power suit that said she refused to be broken, and went to work. Because that's what you do when the system tries to destroy you. You refuse to be destroyed, be why 9 a.m. She was sitting in James Carter's office, ready to begin the formal complaint process. But they had a surprise visitor. Detective Sarah Williams from Internal Affairs had been assigned to investigate the incident. She was a black woman in her mid-30s, 10 years on the force, assigned to Internal Affairs because she'd made enemies by actually investigating complaints seriously. Williams entered James's office and introduced herself. She told Alicia she'd reviewed the body cam footage multiple times. That what she'd seen should never have happened. There was genuine anger in her voice, but also something else. Recognition. She knew what it was like to be a black woman navigating systems designed to protect white male authority. James was immediately protective and skeptical. He said they appreciated her concern, but they'd seen too many internal investigations that were pure theater, designed to pacify the public while protecting bad cops. Williams understood completely, which was exactly why she wanted to be transparent about what they were dealing with. Williams revealed that Marcus Reed had 17 prior complaints filed against him over his 12-year career. 17, and not a single one had been sustained. His partner, Chun, had never reported anything despite witnessing at least some of Reed's misconduct. The union protected Reed. His supervisors protected him because complaints made their statistics look bad, and victims were usually people the system didn't care about. Alicia said it with disgust. 17 complaints, and he was still on the street. Williams confirmed it grimly. He should have been fired years ago. But Alicia was different from his other victims in one crucial way. Experiencing homelessness, sex workers, people the system actively dehumanized. People who filed complaints had disappeared into bureaucratic black holes, never to be seen again. James cut in, saying that was exactly the problem. Justice shouldn't depend on someone's social status. Williams agreed completely. It shouldn't, but they lived in the world as it was, not as it should be. And in this world, Alicia's position gave them levers they rarely had in cases like this. Alicia understood what Williams was really saying. She was being asked to use a privilege, her proximity to power, to get justice that other people couldn't access. It felt wrong, but Williams pushed further. She said if Alicia was willing to be public about this, if she was willing to fight, she might be able to do more than get justice for herself. She might be able to get justice for everyone Reed had hurt over the years. The room went quiet. Alicia understood what was being offered, and what it would cost. Going public meant reliving the trauma over and over. It meant becoming a symbol, a headline, a controversy. It meant testifying at her own confirmation hearing about being assaulted by a police officer, which some senators would absolutely use to question her impartiality, her temperament, her fitness for the bench. But staying silent meant Reed would likely get away with it. Again, like he had 16 times before. It meant other people would be hurt by him in the future. It meant being complicit in the same system that had just brutalized her. Alicia made her decision. She asked Williams to tell her about the other victims, the ones who'd filed complaints against Reed over the years. Williams said she could do better than just tell her. She could introduce Alicia to them. If Alicia was willing, Alicia was willing. Over the next 2 days, Alicia Thompson met with 4 of Marcus Reed's previous victims. Each meeting was arranged privately, confidentially. Each meeting was harder than the last, because each story was a variation of the same nightmare. A nightmare Alicia had now lived herself. The first victim was Jamal Davis. He was 24 years old now, but he'd been 22 when Reed pulled him over for a broken taillight. The traffic stop had escalated quickly. Reed claimed Jamal had reached for something. The body cam footage that mysteriously hadn't been reviewed during the internal investigation, showed Jamal's hands in plain view the entire time. Raised in surrender, Reed had beaten Jamal badly. Badly enough that Jamal spent 2 nights in the hospital with cracked ribs and concussion. He'd filed a complaint at his mother's insistence. She'd said he couldn't let Reed get away with it. But Reed had gotten away with it. The union had claimed Reed feared for his life. That Jamal had been a threat. Jamal was 5'8" and weighed 140 pounds. Reed was 6'2" and 220. But somehow, Jamal had been the threat. When Alicia met with Jamal, he was angry at the system than at Reed himself. He told her she was a prosecutor, that she was part of the machinery that had protected Reed and hurt him. He wasn't wrong. Alicia acknowledged it. She said she couldn't change what had happened to him, but she wanted to try to make sure it didn't happen to anyone else. Jamal was skeptical. He asked how. By becoming a judge? He said judges protected cops too. He'd seen it happen in his own case. Alicia didn't have a good answer. So instead, she removed the scarf she'd been wearing and showed him her bruised face. She told him this was what Reed had done to her. 2 nights ago, while she was about to be confirmed as a judge, Jamal was shocked. He said Reed had assaulted her even knowing who she was, even knowing what she was about to become. Alicia explained that Reed hadn't known, that she'd just been another black woman alone at night to him, another person he could brutalize with impunity, and that was exactly why she was there, Alicia explained. Because Jamal was right, she did a privilege he didn't, and she was going to use it. She was going to make people listen to his story, and to the stories of everyone else Reed had heard. Jamal sat with that for a long moment. Then he agreed to testify. The second victim was Lisa Martinez. She was 31, a single mother of 2. Reed had pulled her over 3 years ago for a traffic violation. She couldn't afford the ticket. Money was tight. It was always tight. She'd asked the officer if there was any way to reduce the fine, maybe do community service instead. Reed had said there was a way. What he described wasn't legal. It wasn't remotely appropriate. It was a proposition that made Lisa's skin crawl. When she'd refused and threatened to report him, Reed had arrested her. For prostitution, the charges had eventually been dropped, but the damage was done. Lisa had lost her job because of the arrest, lost her apartment because she couldn't pay rent, nearly lost her kids to Child Protective Services, all because she'd said no to a cop who thought his badge made him entitled to her body. When Lisa met with Alicia, her voice shook as she recounted the story. Reed had told her she should be grateful he was willing to work with her, like she should thank him for offering to abuse his power and her body. And when she'd refused, he'd punish her for it. Alicia asked if Lisa had filed a complaint. Lisa had tried. They told her it was her word against his, that there was no evidence, that she should drop it or she might be charged with filing a false report. So she dropped it. What choice did she have? She had kids to protect. Alicia told Lisa she had a choice now. She could testify. On the record, with Alicia standing beside her. Lisa was afraid. She said if she testified against the cop, they'd come after her. They'd find a way to hurt her again. Alicia was honest. They might try. But she promised that she would do everything in her power to protect Lisa. And in a week, she'd have the power of the bench behind her. Lisa thought about it. About her kids. About what kind of world she wanted them to grow up in. A world where cops could do whatever they wanted, or a world where someone finally fought back. She agreed to testify. The third victim was Donnell Washington. He was 42 now, though his life had aged him beyond his years. At the time of his encounter with Reed, Donnell had been experiencing homelessness. He'd been living in his car, parking in different spots each night to avoid trouble. Reed had found him sleeping in his car in a Walmart parking lot at 3 a.m., had banged on the window and told him to move along. Donnell had said he would. He just needed a minute to gather his things and wake up fully. That minute of hesitation had been enough for Reed. Reed had accused Donnell of being high. He'd searched the car without consent, without a warrant, without cause. He'd found nothing because there was nothing to find. Frustrated, Reed had grabbed Donnell and slammed his head into the car door. Then he'd arrested him for public intoxication and resisting arrest, to impound fees. He'd lost what little he had. Again, when Donnell met with Alicia, he was weary, exhausted by a system that had been grinding him down his entire life. He asked her why he should trust her. She was part of that system. She'd been a prosecutor. She'd sent people like him to jail. Alicia didn't make excuses. She said he was right. She had been part of the system. But 2 nights ago, that system had turned on her, and she'd realized something she should have understood years ago. She'd been complicit. She'd been so focused on advancing her career, on being one of the good ones, that she hadn't seen how many people were being crushed by the machine she was serving. Donnell asked what she was going to do about it now. Alicia made him a promise. She said she was going to change the system from the inside, with power, with a black robe and a gavel and the authority to make rulings that mattered. She asked if he would help her. Donnell, who had nothing left to lose, agreed. The fourth victim was the hardest. Her name was Destiny Johnson. She was 19 years old. Reed had pulled her over 18 months ago, claiming her car matched the description of a vehicle involved in a crime. It hadn't. There had been no crime. He just wanted an excuse to stop her. She'd been alone. It had been 11 p.m. She'd been terrified. Reed had ordered her out of the car and searched her. But the way he'd searched her, hands lingering in places they had no reason to be, touching her inappropriately, violating her while claiming it was procedure. When she'd asked him to stop, he'd told her that if she didn't cooperate, he'd arrest her for obstruction. Destiny had reported it. They'd told her there was no evidence, that she was making it up, that girls like her were always trying to get money from the department by making false accusations. Girls like her, young, black, poor. They hadn't needed to say more. When Destiny met with Alicia, she was shaking. She hadn't told her story to anyone in months. But something about Alicia, maybe the bruise on her face, maybe the fury in her eyes, made Destiny feel like maybe, finally, someone would believe her. Destiny told her story haltingly, her voice breaking. Alicia listened without interrupting. And when Destiny finished, Alicia said 3 words that Destiny had waited 18 months to hear. "I believe you." Destiny started crying. She asked if Alicia really meant it. Alicia reached across the table and took Destiny's hands in her own. She said yes. She believed her, and she was going to make sure everyone else believed her too. She asked if Destiny would testify. Destiny was afraid. What if people didn't believe her again? What if it made things worse? Alicia told her the truth. It might. This wouldn't be easy. But silence hadn't protected her. Silence had only protected Reed. Destiny agreed to testify. That'll be by the end of the second day. Alicia had spoken with all 4 victims. 4 people Marcus Reed had abused with impunity. 4 people the system had failed completely. She sat in James Carter's office with Detective Williams, overwhelmed by a mix of rage, grief, and an iron determination. Alicia asked a question that had been burning in her mind. How? How had Reed gotten away with this for so long? 17 complaints. 4 victims willing to tell their stories, and those were just the ones they'd found. How many more were out there, too broken or too afraid to come forward? Detective Williams explained the ugly mechanics of police protection. The union defended Reed aggressively, threatening lawsuits and public battles if the department tried to discipline him. His supervisors didn't want complaints sustained on their watch. It made their leadership statistics look bad, potentially derailing their own promotions. And the victims? They were always people society had already marginalized. People with criminal records who could be easily discredited. People experiencing poverty or homelessness who lacked resources to fight. People whose word meant nothing against a cop's testimony. James added another layer, the blue wall of silence. Other officers wouldn't testify against Reed. They closed ranks, protected their own, even when they knew Reed was dirty. Because snitching on another cop made you a pariah. It got you dangerous assignments, backup that arrived late, a career that stalled. So they stayed silent, and Reed kept hunting. Alicia asked what was different this time. Why would this case succeed where 17 others had failed? Williams was direct. The difference was Alicia herself. She was about to be a judge. She had credibility, resources, connections, and a platform. She wasn't easy to discredit or intimidate. And most importantly, she had proof. That body cam footage was undeniable. James added that having multiple victims willing to testify to a pattern of behavior made the case exponentially stronger. It wasn't just one incident that could be dismissed as a misunderstanding. It was a pattern of predatory violence stretching back years. But Alicia was worried. Her confirmation hearing was now just 4 days away. If she went public with this before the hearing, some senators, particularly those who positioned themselves as law and order candidates, would absolutely use it against her. They'd claim she was biased against police, that she couldn't be impartial, that one bad experience had made her unfit to judge fairly. James finished her thought. But if she waited until after confirmation to go public, Reed might escape consequences again. Always, he might hurt someone else in the interim. The IT was an impossible choice. Speak now and risk everything she worked 15 years to achieve. Stay silent and potentially allow more violence. Detective Williams and James both watched her, waiting. The decision was ultimately his alone. Alicia sat in silence for a long moment. She thought about Jamal Davis, beaten so badly he'd been hospitalized. About Lisa Martinez, who'd lost everything for refusing to be assaulted. About Donnell Washington, who'd spent 6 months in jail for being homeless. About Destiny Johnson, who'd been violated by the man supposed to protect her. She thought about all the times she'd prosecuted cases where she'd sensed something was wrong, where a cop's testimony didn't quite add up, but she'd gone along with it anyway because that was her role. She'd been a cog in the machine. She'd chosen career advancement over uncomfortable questions. Not anymore. Alicia looked up at James and Williams. Her voice was steady, certain. She said she was going public. Before the hearing, she would hold a press conference in 2 days. She would show her bruised face. She would tell her story. She would introduce the other victims. And she would dare the Senate to deny her confirmation because she'd had the audacity to speak truth about police violence. James looked concerned. He asked if she understood what this meant. The political firestorm. The attacks on her character. The risk to everything she'd worked for. Alicia said she understood perfectly. And she was doing it anyway, because some things mattered more than a seat on the bench. And if the price of that seat was a silence about injustice, then it was too high a price to pay. 4 victims, Jamal, Lisa, Donnell, and Destiny. In front of her were 24 reporters, cameras, and microphones. Alicia had chosen her clothing carefully. A professional Navy suit that said she was serious, credible, authoritative. But no scarf, no makeup on her face. The bruise was still visible, purple and yellow now, fading but unmistakable. She wanted everyone to see it. She wanted it to be impossible to ignore. The room quieted. Alicia looked directly into the cameras. She knew this press conference would be broadcast live, that it would be replayed endlessly on news channels, that it would define her, for better or worse, for the rest of her career. She began. She stated her name and her position, or rather, her pending position. She was scheduled to appear before the Senate Judiciary Committee in 2 days for her confirmation hearing to become a judge. But before that hearing, she needed to tell the public what had happened to her 5 nights ago. Alicia described the traffic stop in precise detail. The time, the location, the officers' names and badge numbers. She described being pulled over without clear cause. Reed's aggression from the first moment. His refusal to explain why he'd stopped her. His order for her to exit the vehicle. She described the search. Reed's painful grip on her arm. Her instinctive reaction to pull away. And then, she paused for effect, letting the camera zoom in on her face. Then Officer Marcus Reed slapped her, hard enough to leave the bruise everyone could now see. The room erupted. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras flashed. Alicia raised her hand for silence. She wasn't finished. She explained how Reed had then arrested her for resisting arrest and assaulting an officer. How she'd been handcuffed, taken to the station, held in a cell. How the charges had eventually been dropped after her attorney arrived and the body cam footage was reviewed. She stated clearly that she had that footage, that it showed everything, and that she would be releasing it to the media immediately following this press conference. But Alicia continued. This wasn't just about her. This was about a pattern. She gestured to the 4 people standing behind her. She introduced them by name. She briefly summarized what Reed had done to each of them. She explained that Reed had 17 prior complaints, none sustained, and that this pattern of violence had been allowed to continue for over a decade. Alicia's voice grew stronger, more passionate. She said this was about a system that protected violent officers at the expense of the communities they were supposed to serve. A system that only took complaints seriously when the victim had power, resources, and privilege. A system that treated black and brown lives as disposable. She acknowledged her own complicity. For years, she'd been a prosecutor who'd taken cops at their word, who hadn't asked hard enough questions, who would be more concerned with conviction rates than with justice. She'd been part of the problem. But now, she said, she had a choice. She could stay silent to protect her confirmation, or she could speak truth to power, knowing it might cost her everything. She'd chosen truth. If the Senate believed that speaking out against police violence made her unfit to be a judge, then perhaps she wasn't the right person for that bench. But she believed the opposite. She believed that understanding the reality of police violence, experiencing it firsthand, and having the courage to speak about it made her exactly the kind of judge the system needed. Alicia concluded by saying she would be filing a federal civil rights lawsuit against Officer Reed and the police department. She would be advocating for policy changes, and she would be encouraging any other victims of Reed's violence to come forward with a promise that they would be believed and supported. Then she opened the floor for questions. Oh, sound effect, explosion of voices, questions being shouted. The questions came rapid fire. Had she provoked Reed in any way? No. Would she recuse herself from police-related cases if confirmed? She would evaluate each case individually based on its merits. Did she believe all cops were bad? No, but she believed the system protected bad cops too effectively. Would this affect her confirmation? That was up to the Senate. One reporter asked a question that everyone was thinking. Wasn't she worried about retaliation? Alicia didn't hesitate. She said of course she was worried. She'd be a fool not to be. But fear couldn't be the reason for silence. Not anymore. James Carter stepped forward and announced they were releasing the body cam footage immediately. Within minutes, it would be available online. He encouraged everyone to watch it and form their own conclusions about what happened that night. The press conference ended. As Alicia stepped away from the podium, she felt simultaneously lighter and heavier. Lighter because she'd finally told the truth, unburdened herself of the secret shame she'd been carrying. Heavier because she'd just set in motion events she couldn't control. Within an hour, the footage was everywhere. Every major news outlet. Social media. It was impossible to miss. The video showed everything Alicia had described. Reed's aggression, her compliance, the slap, the false arrest. It was damning. Public reaction was swift and divided exactly along the lines everyone expected. Progressive activists and civil rights organizations hailed Alicia's courage. They called for Reed's immediate firing and criminal prosecution. They praised her for using her platform to amplify other victims' voices. But conservative commentators and police unions attacked her viciously. They claimed she was making herself a victim for political gain, that she was anti-police, that she'd obviously done something to provoke Reed that the footage didn't show, that her confirmation should be denied because she clearly couldn't be impartial. The police union held their own press conference that afternoon. They defended Reed, claiming he'd followed proper procedures. They said Alicia had resisted and that Reed had used appropriate force to subdue a combative subject. They conveniently ignored the slap that was clearly visible in the footage. Marcus Reed himself didn't speak publicly. His attorney released a statement saying Reed denied all allegations and looked forward to being exonerated through the internal investigation process. The statement painted him as a dedicated officer being railroaded by someone with an anti-police agenda. That evening, Alicia watched the news coverage in her living room. James sat beside her. They didn't speak much. They just watched as talking heads debated whether she was a hero or troublemaker, whether police violence was real or exaggerated, whether she deserved to be adjudged. Alicia's phone had been ringing nonstop, colleagues offering support or quietly distancing themselves, reporters requesting interviews, advocacy groups wanting her to speak at events, and a few anonymous calls, threats from people who thought she deserved what Reed had done and worse. Her confirmation hearing was in 2 days. Everything now depended on whether the senators believed her story mattered or disqualified her. The Senate Judiciary Committee hearing room was imposing by design. High ceilings, dark wood paneling, senators elevated on a curved dais looking down at the witness table. It was meant to be intimidating. And it was. Narrator, Alicia Thompson sat at that witness table, alone. James Carter sat in the gallery behind her, along with the 4 victims who'd stood with her at the press conference. The room was packed with reporters, activists, police union representatives, and curious observers. Everyone knew this hearing would be unlike any other. The narrator, the committee chair, Senator Robert Mitchell, called the hearing to order. He was a moderate Republican from a swing state, carefully positioned to appeal to both law and order conservatives and justice-minded independents. His opening statement would set the tone. Narrator, Senator Mitchell began by acknowledging the elephant in the room. He said that Ms. Thompson's judicial qualifications had been thoroughly vetted and found exemplary. 15 years as a prosecutor with an impressive record, high marks from the Bar Association, stellar references. Under normal circumstances, her confirmation would be a formality. Narrator, but these were not normal circumstances. 2 days ago, Ms. Thompson had held a press conference making serious allegations against a police officer. She'd released graphic footage. She'd positioned herself as a victim of police violence. And now, the committee needed to determine whether these events affected her fitness to serve as a judge. Narrator, Mitchell emphasized that this wasn't about taking sides in the incident itself. That was a matter for the courts and internal investigations. This was about judicial temperament, impartiality, and whether Ms. Thompson could fairly adjudicate cases involving law enforcement. Narrator, then he invited Alicia to make her opening statement. Narrator, Alicia had prepared these remarks carefully. She'd rewritten them a dozen times. She stood, thanked the committee for the opportunity, and began. Narrator, she acknowledged that her press conference had been controversial, that some people believed she should have stayed silent, handled this privately, not made it public during her confirmation process. But she asked the committee to consider what staying silent would have meant. Narrator, staying silent would have meant allowing Officer Reed to potentially harm others. It would have meant abandoning 4 victims who'd already suffered and been ignored. It would have meant prioritizing her career advancement over justice. And if she was willing to do that before taking the bench, what kind of judge would she be? Narrator, Alicia spoke directly about judicial temperament. She said some might argue that her anger about being assaulted showed she was too emotional to be a judge. But she asked, shouldn't a judge understand injustice intimately? Shouldn't a judge know what it feels like to be powerless in a system designed to protect authority? Shouldn't a judge have the courage to speak truth even when it's costly? Narrator, she addressed the impartiality question head-on. Yes, she now had personal experience with police violence. But that didn't make her anti-police. It made her anti-violence. It made her pro-accountability. She would judge every case on its individual merits. She would apply the law fairly. But she would also bring lived experience that many judges lacked, the experience of being on the receiving end of abuse of power. Narrator, Alicia concluded by saying that the law was supposed to protect everyone equally. But in practice, it often protected those with power at the expense of those without. If confirmed, she would work every day to narrow that gap, to be the judge who saw everyone who entered her courtroom as fully human, fully deserving of justice. Narrator, she sat down. The room was silent for a moment. Then Senator Mitchell thanked her and opened the floor for questions from committee members. Narrator, the first question came from Senator Patricia Reynolds, a progressive Democrat from California. She asked Alicia to describe what happened on the night of March 15th, in her own words. Alicia did, calmly and clearly, sticking to facts. Reynolds then asked how the experience had changed Alicia's understanding of the criminal justice system. Narrator, Alicia was honest. She said it had shattered some of her assumptions. She believed that if you followed the rules, if you were respectful and compliant, you'd be safe. But she'd learned that no amount of compliance guaranteed safety when an officer decided to abuse their power. She'd learned that the system prioritized protecting itself over protecting people. Narrator, the next question came from Senator James Harding, a conservative Republican from Texas. His tone was skeptical, almost hostile. He asked if Alicia's obvious anger toward police would make it impossible for her to rule fairly in criminal cases. Narrator, Alicia didn't flinch. She said her anger wasn't toward police broadly. It was toward officers who abused their power and systems that protected them. She noted that Officer Reed represented a tiny fraction of law enforcement. Most officers were honest, dedicated public servants. But the few bad ones did immense damage, both to communities and to the reputation of good officers. Narrator, Harding pressed harder. He asked if she could honestly sit on the bench and give the benefit of the doubt to police testimony, given what happened to her. Alicia's response was measured but firm. She said she'd spent 15 years as a prosecutor giving police testimony tremendous weight, perhaps too much weight. Now she would evaluate all testimony skeptically, as judges should. She would demand evidence. She would ask hard questions. And yes, she would be alert to the possibility that officers might lie or abuse power, because she now knew firsthand that it happened. Narrator, wasn't that skepticism exactly what made her unfit? Harding asked. Alicia replied that skepticism was what made her fit. A judge who blindly trusted authority was a rubber stamp, not a check on power. Narrator. The hearing continued for hours. Question after question. Senator after senator. Some supportive, some hostile, most calculating political angles. They asked about her record as a prosecutor, her judicial philosophy, her views on qualified immunity, on police reform, on criminal justice broadly. Narrator. But they kept returning to the Reed incident, over and over, because that was what everyone wanted to know. Could she be fair after this? Narrator. During a brief recess, James met with Alicia in an anteroom. He told her she was doing well, holding her ground, but he could see she was exhausted. She'd been reliving the trauma for hours, answering invasive questions about the worst night of her life, all while maintaining perfect composure. Narrator. Alicia asked James what he thought. Would they confirm her? James was honest. He didn't know. It would be close. Some Democrats were solidly yes. Some Republicans were solidly no. It would come down to 3 or 4 swing vote senators who were evaluating political calculations more than her qualifications, to Alicia's integrity, temperament, and fitness. The first witness was Judge Martha Washington, a black woman in her 70s who'd served on the federal bench for 30 years. She'd been one of the first black female judges in the state. She spoke about Alicia appearing before her court dozens of times as a prosecutor. She praised Alicia's fairness, preparation, and respect for the process. She said Alicia would be an excellent judge. But Judge Washington also said something else. She said that being a black woman in the legal system required constant code switching, constant vigilance, constant awareness that you were being judged by different standards. She said she'd been pulled over by police more than once, treated with suspicion despite her position. She said Alicia's experience with Reed was horrifying but not surprising. And she said the question shouldn't be whether that experience disqualified Alicia, but whether the system that allowed it to happen should be allowed to continue unchanged. The second witness was Michael Torres, a veteran police officer with 25 years on the force. He was taking a risk by appearing. The police union had made clear that any officer who supported Alicia would be viewed as a traitor. But Torres believed some things mattered more than union solidarity. Torres testified that most officers were good people trying to do a hard job, but he acknowledged that bad officers existed, that the system protected them too well, and that accountability was essential. He said he'd watched the body cam footage of Reed assaulting Alicia. He said it made him ashamed. That Reed's actions betrayed everything police work should be about. Torres said he believed Alicia would be fair to police officers who did their jobs honorably, and he believed she would hold accountable those who didn't. That's what good judges did. The third and final witness was Destiny Johnson, the 19-year-old Reed had assaulted 18 months ago. James had debated whether to call her. She was young, traumatized, easily rattled. But Alicia had insisted. Destiny's voice mattered. Destiny was terrified. Her hands shook as she was sworn in. Senator Mitchell, to his credit, spoke to her gently. He thanked her for her courage in appearing. He asked her simply to tell the committee why she was there. Destiny's voice was quiet at first, but it grew stronger as she spoke. She described what Reed had done to her, how he'd violated her under the guise of a search, how she reported it and been dismissed, accused of lying, told girls like her couldn't be trusted. Narrator. She said when she'd heard about what happened to Ms. Thompson, she'd been angry at first, angry that it took Reed assaulting someone important for anyone to care. But then Ms. Thompson had done something no one else had done. She believed Destiny. She'd fought for Destiny. She'd put her own career on the line to make sure Destiny's story was heard. Destiny looked directly at the senators. She said Ms. Thompson was the kind of person who should be a judge, someone who understood what it felt like to be powerless. Someone who had power now and was using it to protect people who didn't. When Destiny finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the gallery. Even some of the hardest senators looked moved. Senator Mitchell thanked her for her testimony. The hearing concluded. Senator Mitchell announced that the committee would vote the following day. Alicia had done everything she could. Now it was out of her hands. Sound effect, gavel, people standing, movement. As Alicia left the chamber, reporters swarmed her. She said nothing, just walked past and flanked by James. Outside, she finally allowed herself to breathe. She'd survived, but survival wasn't the same as victory. That night, Alicia couldn't sleep. Again, She lay in bed replaying the hearing, analyzing every question, every response, every senator's facial expression, trying to count votes, trying to predict an outcome she couldn't control. She thought about how far she'd come. A black girl from a working-class neighborhood who'd fought her way through college and law school, who'd worked brutal hours as a junior prosecutor, who'd proven herself over and over again. And now it might all be taken away because she refused to be silent about injustice. But she also thought about Jamal, Lisa, Donnell, and Destiny, about how their lives had been destroyed by Reed, and how the system had shrugged and moved on. If speaking for them cost her the bench, it was worth it. The next morning, the committee voted. The vote was along party lines, mostly. 11 Democrats voted yes. 8 Republicans voted no. But 3 Republicans broke ranks, including Senator Mitchell. They voted yes. 14-9. Alicia Thompson's nomination would move to the full Senate for a final vote. The full Senate confirmation vote happened 2 weeks later. It was closer than the committee vote, 52-48. But close didn't matter. Alicia Thompson had been confirmed as a federal judge. The swearing-in ceremony was small, private. Just Alicia, James, a handful of friends and family, and Judge Martha Washington, who administered the oath. When Alicia raised her right hand and swore to faithfully discharge the duties of her office, she felt the weight of the black robe settle on her shoulders. Not just a physical weight, but the weight of responsibility, of power, of the trust that had been placed in her. Her first day on the bench was overwhelming. The courtroom was formal, imposing. Her name was on a placard, the Honorable Judge Alicia Thompson. She sat in the high-backed chair, looked down at the room, and felt the power dynamic she'd experienced from the other side for years. She vowed to herself that she would never forget what it felt like to be powerless, that she would see every defendant, every witness, every person who entered her courtroom as fully human. Meanwhile, the civil rights lawsuit against Officer Marcus Reed and the police department moved forward. The department had tried to settle quietly, offering Alicia a substantial sum to make the case go away. She'd refused. This wasn't about money. It was about accountability. That they'd also tried to argue that Reed should be granted qualified immunity, a legal doctrine that shields officers from civil liability unless they violated clearly established rights. Alicia's attorneys argued that the right not to be slapped during a traffic stop was about as clearly established as rights got. The district court agreed. Qualified immunity was denied. Reed's criminal trial for assault was scheduled 9 months after the incident. The prosecutor, one of Alicia's former colleagues, had initially seemed reluctant to bring charges. But public pressure and the undeniable video evidence made it politically impossible not to prosecute. Alicia couldn't be involved in the criminal case, obviously, but she attended the trial as a witness. She sat in the witness box and testified about what Reed had done. The defense attorney tried to paint her as someone with a vendetta, someone whose career aspirations had motivated false accusations. But the video didn't lie. And Alicia's testimony was calm, factual, unshakable. He would never be a cop again. The civil trial happened a year after the incident. This time, all 4 victims testified: Jamal, Lisa, Donnell, and Destiny. They described what Reed had done to them, how the system had failed them, the pattern of abuse stretching back over a decade. The defense tried to discredit each victim. They brought up criminal records, questioned credibility, suggested ulterior motives. But the accumulation of testimony was damning. 4 people, attacked by the same officer, all with similar stories. All ignored until someone with power forced the system to listen. The jury awarded Alicia $3 million in compensatory and punitive damages. But more importantly, they awarded each of the other 4 victims substantial damages as well. Jamal received $1.2 million. Lisa, $900,000, Donnell, $800,000, and Destiny, whose case was perhaps the most egregious, received $1.50 million. Police department was also ordered to implement sweeping reforms. Body cameras that couldn't be turned off, independent investigation of all use of force complaints, an end to investigating themselves, real accountability. That IT wasn't perfect. It wouldn't undo the trauma. But it was something. 2 years after the incident, Judge Alicia Thompson was presiding over her courtroom when a familiar case appeared on her docket. A young black man named Deshaun Miller was accused of resisting arrest. The arresting officer claimed Miller had been combative, aggressive, dangerous. The body cam footage told a different story. Alicia watched the footage carefully. She saw an officer escalate needlessly, saw a young man trying to comply while being shouted at, saw hands that were visible the entire time, saw fear, not aggression. The prosecutor, young and eager, argued that the officer's testimony should be given great weight, that officers deserved the benefit of the doubt, that resisting arrest was a serious charge. Alicia looked at the prosecutor, looked at the defense attorney, looked at Deshaun Miller, who sat with his hands folded, trying to make himself small. She ruled that the officer's testimony was not credible, that the video contradicted his claims, that charging someone with resisting arrest when they were clearly trying to comply was an abuse of power. She dismissed all charges. After the hearing, Deshaun's mother approached the bench. She was crying. She thanked Judge Thompson, said she'd been terrified her son would be convicted for doing nothing wrong, said she'd heard about Judge Thompson's story, about what had happened to her, said it gave her hope that someone on the bench finally understood. That night, Alicia sat in her chambers alone. She thought about the long road that had led her here, the traffic stop, the slap, the humiliation of being arrested, the terror that her career was over, the decision to speak publicly despite the risks, the brutal confirmation hearing, and now, the power to actually change outcomes of people who looked like her, who had experienced what she'd experienced. She thought about Marcus Reed. He was in prison now, stripped of his badge, his authority, his ability to hurt anyone else. But she also thought about all the years he'd operated with impunity, all the people he'd harmed before someone with power finally stopped him. The system hadn't protected those earlier victims. The system had only responded when Reed had made the mistake of assaulting someone who couldn't be easily discredited, someone who had resources, someone who was about to have power. That was the ugly truth. Justice had been selective, available to her in a way it hadn't been available to Jamal, Lisa, Donnell, or Destiny. At least not until she'd used her privilege to amplify their voices. But now she had real power. The power of the bench. The power to make rulings that mattered. The power to see the people who came before her as fully human, not as case numbers or statistics. She wouldn't always get it right. She'd make mistakes. The system was too broken for one judge to fix. But she could make a difference in her courtroom. She could be the judge she'd needed that night in the police station, someone who believed victims, who questioned authority, who demanded accountability. 3 years after the incident, Alicia was invited to speak at a legal conference about police accountability and judicial reform. She almost declined. She was tired of being defined by what had happened to her. She wanted to be known for her jurisprudence, not for being a victim. But then she thought about all the young lawyers, especially young lawyers of color, who needed to hear that the system could change, that speaking truth to power, even at great personal cost, was worth it. She accepted the invitation. At the conference, standing before hundreds of attorneys and judges, Alicia told her story one more time. But she didn't end with the assault or the confirmation or even the trial. She ended with a wake. She talked about the cases she'd handled where she'd seen police overreach and been able to check it, about the defendants who'd been given fair hearings when other judges might have rubber-stamped prosecutions, about the small ways she tried to make the system more just, one ruling at a time. She acknowledged that one judge couldn't fix everything, but she argued that everyone with power, whether it was a judge's gavel or a prosecutor's discretion or a cop's badge, had a choice. Use that power to uphold the status quo, or use it to push toward justice. After her speech, a young black woman approached her. She was a law student, first in her family to attend college. She said she'd been ready to drop out because she didn't see how someone like her could make a difference in a system that felt so hostile. But hearing Judge Thompson's story had changed her mind. The student asked for advice. Alicia thought for a moment. Then she said, "Don't let them make you small. Don't let them silence you. When you see injustice, speak, especially when it costs you something, because silence is a cost too, and you'll never forgive yourself for staying quiet when you had the chance to speak." The student thanked her and walked away. Alicia watched her go, hoping she'd have the courage to follow that advice, hoping the system would be kinder to her than it had been to previous generations. But hope wasn't enough. Change required people willing to fight, willing to risk, willing to stand up when it would be easier to sit down. 5 years after the traffic stop, Marcus Reed was released from prison. He'd served his sentence. He would never be a police officer again, but he was free. Some people argued he should have gotten more time. Others thought the whole thing had been a witch hunt. Alicia didn't think about Reed much anymore. He'd taken up enough space in her life. She was more interested in the future than the past, in the work still to be done. She'd helped establish a legal clinic that represented victims of police violence, trained a generation of young prosecutors to question cop testimony more rigorously, mentored law students who wanted to use the law as a tool for justice, not just career advancement. Couldn't save everyone, couldn't fix everything, but she could do the work. One case at a time, one ruling at a time, one person at a time. Because that night on Maple Street, when Marcus Reed had his elbow, he'd taught her a different lesson. He'd taught her that power could be wielded to crush people, or it could be wielded to protect them. And when you finally got power, real power, the kind that came with a black robe and a gavel, you had to choose. Alicia Thompson had made her choice. Every day, she made it again. She chose justice over convenience, truth over comfort, accountability over loyalty to institutions that didn't deserve it. And whenever she sat on that bench, looking down at her courtroom, she remembered what it felt like to be powerless, to be handcuffed in the back of a patrol car, to be treated as less than human. She remembered. And she made sure it mattered, because that's what power was for. Not to elevate yourself, but to lift others. Not to protect the system, but to transform it. Officer Marcus Reed had slapped a black woman on a quiet street, thinking he could get away with it one more time, that he didn't know that seconds later, well, months and years later, but the moment had been set in motion. She would be the judge, and she would remember this has been justice delayed, the judge they didn't see coming. The story of how one moment of violence became a catalyst for change, how one woman refused to be silenced, and how power, when wielded with integrity, can bend the arc toward justice. Justice is never guaranteed, but it's always worth fighting for. To apt her and arrested her and tried to destroy her career. He'd thought he was teaching her a lesson about power, about who had it and who didn't, about knowing your place,